this topic that we're going to be discussing on the various challenges and headwinds that the real estate industry is facing today is not something that can be fixed overnight. If you've been watching the news, if you've been reading the media releases, we have storm clouds on the horizon when it comes to the housing industry for a lot of different reasons. We've got inflation. We've got rising interest rates. We've got supply chain issues. We've got a lack of buildable and developable land. We have a retiring skilled workforce. People that used to do the trades of being a plumber, being an electrician. When the Great Recession hit, a lot of those people got completely out of the industry because there wasn't any work anywhere. And a lot of them didn't come back. And the new careers that they pursued, they stayed doing what they were doing. And we're not filling those positions any longer. So you combine all of those factors together, and we've got a real problem, especially on the affordable housing front for the younger generation, the first-time home buyer. I read where the affordability index, this came out a couple days ago, is the worst it's been since 1989 for first-time buyers because we just cannot make enough new homes. It's just not, the pipeline is not available. The pipe keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So today we've got 4 excellent panelists. Each are going to touch on a different part of these topics that I've just shared with you, but each of them brings a separate and unique expertise that I really think you're going to walk away today going, I didn't know that. I really didn't know that. So our first speaker is with the Community Development Director for Oregon City, Aquila Hurd-Ravitch. Hope I got that right. She's only been with Oregon City for a year. She replaced Laura Turway. Previously to that, she served 13 years in a similar role as Community Development Director down in Tualatin. She's anxious to be here. Her only request is that you be nice to her. Okay, you can throw her some zinger questions, that's all right. Then after that, we'll have Roseanne Johnson, who used to be the Assistant Governmental Affairs Representative for the Home Builders Association. I've dealt with Roseanne on a lot of issues pertaining to home building. She now is with Lennar, and I'll just read a little bit of her responsibilities. She's the entitlements manager for Lennar Northwest, a residential developer builder. In this capacity, she obtains federal, state, and local land use approvals for new communities in Oregon and Southwest Washington. She's very much engaged in policy and advocacy and community affairs, political action, educational programming to advance the residential building industry. That was a mouthful, but she's excellent. Next, we're going to have Harlan Barlow, who is with ICON, and they're celebrating today. Last night, the Oregon City Planning Commission voted 5-2 to approve a fairly large master plan community in the Park Place concept plan. So Harlan's happy. So a little bit about Harlan's background. He is a land development and acquisitions manager for ICON Construction. His responsibilities include sourcing and acquiring residential and commercial land for development, conducting contract negotiations and overseeing due diligence activities, directing land use, engineering activities, and supporting site development construction. So you have a lot of time on your hands, obviously. Okay. And lastly, we have Devin Ellen, the Director of Housing Development with the Housing Authority of Clackamas County. She's responsible for planning, managing, and implementing the authority's development goals and overseeing Clackamas County's Metro Housing Bond Program. So again, I know you're probably all going to have a lot of questions, so the question cards are on your table. Someone will come around and collect those. But we want to go ahead and get started because I know there's a lot of information they want to share. So Aquila, we'll have you go first.
Good afternoon. I think this is my clicker. Thank you for the introduction, and I did request that since I'm not quite a year in that you all be nice to me, so which I'm sure you will be. And I'm also filling in for Christina Robertson-Gardner, who did most of the work on our HB 2001, which is our middle housing policy. So I think I know as much as Christina, but she's got a lot of the background and answers. Okay, so there we go. All right, so just to start out with what our typical development process looks like. It starts out with a partition and subdivision, and that's an administrative process. Type 2 is a term that basically means that there's notice. The staff reviews your application, sends out a notice to folks within 300 feet of the site, and then it's subject to 120 days, that 120-day rule. We have a pre-application meeting, and there are public improvements that are required to be completed. So there's the subdivision piece, and then it goes into the building permit review. And that's a pretty typical process that we go through now. So that has changed just slightly, but one of the major pieces of the House Bill 2001 is that it allows for duplex, triplex, cluster homes to be built on single-family residential lots with the same review that a single-family home would have had. So this was passed in 2019, and it was intended to address rising housing costs, and the bill required that cities revise their code to allow these middle housing types in all residential zones. And basically that means wherever we allowed single-family homes, we had to allow these other middle housing types. And again, it was basically to address increasing housing costs, changing households, and then addressing systemic injustices. So what that means is most of those types get a type 1 process. So type 1 is over the counter. It's the same thing as a building permit. Basically, you come in, you show us that you've met all the standards, and then you're on your way as long as you meet the standards. So all of those middle housing types are now reviewed through a type 1 process, which means no pre-application and no notice, right, to neighbors, that kind of thing. And then there are some public improvements that are required. It's based on the 10% valuation of the project. The other piece of that, so that's the process, and then the next piece is the design piece. And so those design standards have the same, very similar design standards as single-family residential lots. So you're still looking at the same setbacks, lot coverage, that kind of thing. One of the things that we looked at was how to encourage the retention of older housing stock. So one of the pieces that was adopted is you can build a duplex or a triplex that's detached as long as you leave the single-family home up, I think something like 5 years or more. Then the next piece is Senate Bill 458, and that's the Middle Housing Land Division. So this allows for more home ownership on a single-family lot. So it was intended to increase opportunities for ownership. It's an expedited land division process, which is now type 2, and so that's kind of our jargony term for meaning now there's notice. There's a pre-application meeting. We review it, and, there's no pre-application required with this process, but we still review it and then send notice out to within 300 feet of the site. There are some public improvements that are required, and you cannot do this type of subdivision without middle housing submittal. So they can be together, or you can do the middle housing, build your triplex, and then come back later and do the division. They have to have their own separate utilities, and then each unit owns the land underneath it. Let's see. So the City Commission adopted these new code changes last June, early June. They were required to be in place by the end of June, otherwise the state's model code applied. So that was adopted, and we went with kind of a two-tiered system where we started out with minimum compliance. So whatever the state was requiring, we changed our code to make sure that we met those requirements. And then we set up a separate tract so that we could come back and look at other policy questions. So if we wanted to go beyond these minimum requirements, we can do that, but we needed more time to really vet some of the ideas. And so that's kind of what this slide is looking at, is if you're interested in tracking what some of those other policy options are, you can go to our webpage and sign up to get updated on what those changes may be and when they'll occur. The other piece that we have to look at in the coming years is a housing production strategy. So the House Bill 2001 kind of had these two pieces, and the housing production strategy will happen a couple years from now. And that's more looking at tools about how we can provide more housing. We recently adopted a housing needs analysis, and that's kind of my way of looking at it is like a supply and demand. How much housing is there, and what is the demand for housing? And the production strategy looks at, okay, what are the tools we need to actually meet the demand that's out there? Just circling back a little bit on the land use piece, so this second package that's going to come up in October, some of the things that we'll talk about, we're going to go back and look at some of the density requirements and the lot coverage requirements. We didn't really get into what the high density residential district looks like because we didn't allow single-family homes, so we didn't need to touch that. But we're going to go back and look and see if we need to make some adjustments. There was a request to look at tiny homes, so we'll start that discussion. And we'll also look at land use incentives for affordable housing. One of the other pieces was to look at accessory dwelling units. Since now we can have these detached duplexes, we kind of need to figure out what's the difference between an accessory dwelling unit and a detached duplex. That's still to be decided. Part of the tools that we'll look at with the housing production strategy, actually, and things that the state requires that we look at are the system development charge rate scale. We'll look at various tax abatement programs, and then we'll also look at the possibility of a construction excise tax. So that's all to come. That housing production strategy and those tools are not supposed to happen. They don't have to happen until somewhere around 2025 to 2027. We may start that discussion earlier should the City Commission wish to go there. And that's what I have for you on House Bill 2001. So I think the idea is we're going to go through all the presentations and then you can ask questions at the end.
So my name is Roseanne Johnson. I'm Entitlements Manager for Lennar Northwest. I do have to give a shout out to my former colleagues, including my parents who showed up. We used to work together in a family business doing infill development in Portland, and now I work for a big bad developer that does work all over the state and in Southwest Washington. So in between there, I have my former HBA colleagues, Jody and Shelly. I was a contemporary with Wes over at Clackamas County, and Pete, thank you, worked with you, as well as Aquila when I worked with HBA. So thank you. All right, I entitled this presentation, Real Estate's Real Deal, because the real deal that I work with every day is how to get to yes on what can be built down the road. So getting the approvals on paper and then prepping the land. Really, that's what it's all about from a day-to-day basis for me. And that takes a lot of different types of conversations and work with different jurisdictions and property owners. Let me get my clicker over here. Okay, so I want to start this out by saying that producing that buildable land that can eventually be built on is truly a public-private investment. For years and decades before the actual construction of a business or a home that people see, there is public investment in that land and in the planning for that land to be built upon. So we have things that the government does at the state, local, and sometimes federal level, but we'll stay at the state and local level. So for example, urban growth boundary expansions in our state are very important to having a supply pipeline of buildable land. I think Oregon City's last one is maybe the early 2000s. Let's see, then we have comprehensive planning and zoning and concept planning that the city and state takes the lead on. And then on the private side, and sometimes nonprofit side, but property owners and developers really work together on, okay, formulating the plan for what can actually go in that concept plan that the government has, with public input, come to approve. So that the lead that the property owner or the developer takes is varied, but it's really in partnership and concurrent with all the work that the government agencies have done, usually a little bit afterward. So the point of this slide is, as time goes on, with the calendar months blowing away, more and more public and private investment is made into buildable land. So that's really important as we look at the cost of housing down the road if we don't have that public and private investment that we made good on. So I'm entitlements manager. What does that mean? Entitlements are how we get the approvals on paper for what we can build later on. Some things that are involved in that process are lots of consultants, due diligence, looking at what the code says about a given parcel of land and what can ultimately be built there, what public improvements or facility improvements are going to need to be made. Preparing the land use application is a big deal. Then once the application is into the state and local authorities, sometimes federal, if you have like a wetland, for example, it has to go to a federal authority body, then you pay, for those bodies to review that, so there's fees and costs associated there. Then comes the fun part, the public hearings. You heard about Icon Construction's recent public hearing that approved tentatively the Park Place master plan or subdivision. But those hearings can, go either way sometimes. If there's a lot of public opposition, they can, stagnate a future community. And then all of this, equates to time. So in the development world, we say time is money. It's cliche, but it really is true. And I think, going back to that public-private investment, the more time that it takes to get a project that's really been planned for decades in some conceptual form, the more it's going to cost. So that's really important too as we look at the cost of real estate and property and housing. Okay, so I wanted to just give you a glimpse into my world doing land development and entitlements. These are some of the costs, and I wanted to segment them out by soft costs and hard costs. So the soft costs are the ones that no one ever really sees, but they still cost money. When you have to have, your arborist go out on site and assess the health of the trees and how you're going to preserve them or which ones need to be taken down. Archaeological, that's an increasingly important cost with tribal lands or tribal interests in land that has been designated to be built on. So having an archaeological dig team out on site is an increasing cost nowadays. Another example would be your HOA. You form your homeowners association for a mixed-use community or a residential community well ahead of there actually being homes there. So that all the landscaping can be taken care of. So those are ongoing costs. And then the hard costs, of course, that we see actual, diggers and movers and pavers out on site, laying the pipes, putting the roads down. Those are all more visual, and we call those hard costs, things that are actually being done on site to change the topography or to change the way people are going to use that land, right, down the road. All right, another way of looking at land development is by where it occurs. So it can be an on-site with if you have a mixed-use community or a commercial community or a residential community, that area needs to have its own backbone infrastructure put in place to serve the residents, but it also is going to impact things that are not in the community, right? Think about, the park that your kids are going to need to go to that may not be in your subdivision or may not be in that commercial business park, but the workers there need to have open space to enjoy while they're on their break, for example. And then, so the on-site and off-site, the point here is that those improvements are all things that get agreed upon ahead of time and then have to be in place before anyone ever sees any vertical construction, whether it be commercial, industrial, or residential. Oh, and I put system development charges in there. Those are one-time fees that any kind of developer pays to accommodate the impact that that community will have on the existing community. So upgrades to, enhanced capacity essentially for the new growth. So growth does in fact pay for itself and accommodates its new existence in your community. Okay, so what does that all lead us to? We have all this approvals on paper and land development, laying the pipes, paving the streets. What do we get out of it? We get that visual in the center. We get something like that, right? A beautifully paved street with mountable curbs and a bunch of dirt that's been graded that can now have maybe a commercial business park, a house, a mixed-use live-work community. So all of those costs and all those that time that the public and the private put in, along with raw land that was designated for some sort of development, got us to this buildable state, right? No actual buildings yet, though. I did put some examples up there in the upper right-hand corner of what could go there, though. Parks or little store, corner store, houses. All right, so this brings me to the concept of the land share of housing. So this is a concept that I've been thinking about over the past few years in my capacity doing policy work, but then now back in the development field, which is how much does the land as a percentage of that property value take up? We have this idea that when you see a house for sale or you see a business for sale, that it's just that structure that's for sale, but it's really the land and everything that went into it beforehand to get it to a buildable state that is the full property value price. So expressed as a percentage, the land share of house value, and I'm focusing here on houses because that's how this data is conveyed, is the value of the land divided by the value of the property. So like you see a home for sale, you see a business for sale, and it's expressed as a percentage. So you divide one into the other, times it by 100, you have your percentage of land as a portion of the property value itself. And that really is, again, everything that it took from the raw land state to get it to that buildable land state. That's what the land share of house value is. And again, it excludes any vertical construction costs. So labor and materials are the big ones for your vertical construction. And then this visual is also really, I think, demonstrative. It demonstrates that the land share of house value is here in the state of Oregon, like in our metro service area, Portland, Vancouver, Salem, I believe it is. And this is from the American Enterprise Institute, and they partner with Rutgers to produce this interactive data, which I find really interesting because you can see that for the latest year of data, back in 2020, at least half, if not up to 2/3, or nearly 2/3 of a given property value is the cost of that land and to get it to the buildable state that it's currently in with development on it. This is data, again, from AEI and Rutgers, and the professor there, Dave Morris, I think. So it's not just a local phenomenon, it's across the nation and across the state. And most importantly, you see it across the state. On the left there, from 2012 to 2020, it's gone up from in the mid 30th percentile to the high 50s as a portion of the property value. Again, it's a national trend. 54.7% of a given property value is the land, the buildable land that's available to be built on. And then in our zip code, 97045, it's hovering, or it was hovering at 54%. So over half the value of any property you see for sale around here is the land and all the costs and all the work that the public and the private entities put in to get it to that state. All right, in conclusion, my bullet points are, land really is a valuable resource that has taken a lot of years and time and planning by local and state and federal, sometimes, authorities, as well as the private entities and the nonprofit entities. It's not just the private developer coming in and saying, we're gonna build a subdivision here. It's actually starts a lot ahead of time. We use land in a variety of ways, right? Commercial, industrial, farms, preserving forests, homes to live in also have to go in there. So we live and work in a certain way in our modern society, and so I see development as a really valuable role in our modern society, so we can actually have amenities and houses to live in, or campsites to go camping in when we don't want to live in our houses. And then the local governments, predominantly metro as well as counties and cities in our state, they take decades ahead of any construction that you see on the ground to plan for what type of conceptual development can actually be there. So that's a really important point that in my whole public-private partnership theme here. And then, so once that happens, the development community is very attracted to that land that has been planned in such a way. So they, gravitate towards land that's been designated for commercial or residential or mixed-use development. And they start getting involved. And they meet the local and state and federal guidelines. And then try to get those approvals to actually build something. So, it doesn't just stop there though, right? It's like all those costs have been put in, so we want to kind of make good or realize the efforts that both the public and the private have put in. But it is, I have to say, the largest line item in a construction budget. So if I can have you take away, it's the public and the private have invested in this big, huge cost and time to get to a buildable state for land. And from that standpoint, it makes sense to follow through on something that can be utilized, right? Yeah, and it can be a positive impact on your community. So with that, I will thank you for your time and go Oregon City.
Thanks, Roseanne. I'm Harlan Barrow with Icon Construction. Kent asked me to talk a little bit about the real challenges that we're facing in getting property from its raw state and acquiring it through entitlements like Roseanne talked about, through development like Roseanne touched on, and then the home building side. And the last couple years have been really difficult on the home building side in particular. But a lot of things are challenging. And so what we thought we would do is just talk through some of these things and then some headwinds at the end. So from an acquisition standpoint, and as Kent mentioned, I handle both acquisitions and help out on development at Icon. I worked for a national home builder, Richmond American Homes, in the 2000s out of the corporate office in in Denver, and I was involved in looking at markets all across the country. And in 2005, we were tracking things across the country, and it became clear that land prices were going up faster than house prices. And that was a big red flag, and we started sort of pushing back. And I say it's sort of like 2005 in the sense that right now, every land seller I talk to thinks this is the greatest market in the world, and their property is worth gazillions of dollars. And I have to kind of explain that it looks good right now, but for all the reasons that Roseanne talked about, we're probably not going to be building houses on that land for 2 years, maybe 3 years. And right now, it sort of feels a little like '05 in the sense that we're not so sure things are going to be that rosy in 2 years. So it's a hard education process sometimes. And also, you know, house prices right now and affordability and everything is unsustainable and will adjust. It's just a question of how much. Some of the differences between 2005 and now, though, particularly around here, there's a much more constrained lot supply. So it's pushing in other directions from those other two issues. And there's also, we're seeing a bit more of a demand for housing, single-family housing in particular, as people, because of COVID, are trying to get out of apartments and density and try and not be around a lot of other people. And by the way, pardon my mask, but I take care of my 87-year-old dad who has leukemia, and he has no immunity, so I have to be really careful, so sorry about that. But anyway, and then as Aquila was talking about the wonderful HB 2001 world, which has a lot of interesting aspects from a developer, home builder perspective. But in talking with landowners, it's a very difficult situation because they read the headlines. Middle housing says I can build 2 or 3 houses on every lot. So therefore my property is worth 2 or 3 times what it was before, right? Well, no, it doesn't really work that way. It's maybe a 20 or 30% bump, depending upon where you are and what you're building and what the lots are like. You know, and I just kind of, a quick little example, right? If you had a 5,000 square foot lot and you build a 2,500 square foot house on it that, you know, depending on where you are, sells for $650, and you make a 10% margin, which, as we'll talk about, is really hard to do these days, you'd make $65,000 as a builder. And now if you build 2 duplexes on that, and say you get 2 1,800 square foot attached units that, you know, sell for, say, $475, so you'd end up with a $90,000 profit, or about $25,000 more. It's really more like a 20 or 30% on a dollar basis perspective, but then you have a lot of other costs that you have to consider, because one of the things that HB 2001 and SB 458, when they were envisioned, I think, the focus was really on infill, existing lots, going in and buying a house on a half acre and building a duplex in an existing neighborhood. The folks that crafted all of this, I don't think really had a lot on their minds about how this was going to play with new subdivisions and new developments. And it's really putting a lot of strain on municipalities, the cities, the counties, on how to deal with that when you're talking about new subdivisions. And it's going to be interesting because you know, if you go to do a duplex on an existing lot and there's sewer and water and everything in the street, and you just go and you cut and you make your connections, that's great. If you have a 40-lot subdivision that you put in for approval, and then you want to do middle housing, well, you have one lateral, now you have to put in two, say, because you build duplexes, but maybe the jurisdiction has a moratorium on street cutting. And so now, instead of like at the other place, you just make your T-cut and fill it in with asphalt and you move on, because of this moratorium, now you have to repave the whole street. And that adds to the costs and makes it less affordable. And then, of course, your construction costs on attached stuff is often a bit higher, meeting fire codes and things. And most jurisdictions don't yet have sliding scales for SDCs. It costs as much for the big house as it does for the smaller house. And so on a proportional basis to price, it gets to be a higher percentage. Just briefly on entitlements, because Roseanne went through most of that. Some of the challenges are a lot of municipalities have been understaffed, and thankfully Oregon City is no longer understaffed, so that's wonderful. But it's not that way in a lot of other jurisdictions. Sometimes things are getting updated and it's kind of a moving target, so you don't really know exactly where you're going to end up. And I had a planning friend of mine at one of the many consultants that we all use who said he thinks it's going to be like the Wild West for a couple years. Nobody really knows how it's going to go, and so particularly on new subdivisions. It's going to be interesting, see how it all shakes out. From a development standpoint, some of the challenges are kind of similar. Understaffed in municipalities that lead to longer times for engineering review and getting permits and things like that. And here, time is really money, because typically when you do an acquisition, you don't buy it unless you're a speculator, but most people like us, like Icon, we wouldn't buy the property until the entitlements are done. So we don't buy it until we know what it is that we're buying. But then, now you own it, and you've put all this money out, and you've got loan and carry costs for all the time that it takes to get through engineering and permitting. And, you know, when staffs are short, it can take a lot longer than we in the development community would like, anyway. There's also a lot of utility company delays now, dealing with PGE and Northwest Natural and, you know, Comcast and folks like that, not only from their staffing and design issues, but also just getting equipment out of them. It takes 6 to 8 months to get a power pole, a pole for a street light. 6 to 8 months. Some of the transformers and switches and things like that from PGE can take a year now. And this is getting into some of the supply chain stuff. It's just, you know, there's a lot of time sitting around waiting for things. Labor shortages, as Kent mentioned, you know, it was a lot worse when there was all the stimulus and the unemployment kickers. I think somebody calculated around here that at the height of all of that, if you made less than $65,000 a year, it made no sense to work because you got more money from all of that than working. That's gotten better, but it's still hard to find people because, like Kent said, a lot of people went out of the trades and they go other places. It's not quite as bad as in the heyday when, you know, people would come steal your crews and they'd go to California or something, but it's still pretty hard. And generally just supply chain issues. They're not getting better. They're not getting worse anymore, but they're not getting better. Still takes forever to get stuff. And it just costs more for everything. And from a development standpoint also, the thing to remember is all the low-hanging fruit, all the easy land that was there to develop is developed. What's left now are the sides of hills and, you know, things that cost a lot more to develop than flat land. So those are all challenges from a development standpoint. From the home building standpoint, it's been a wild ride. This is a graph of lumber prices for the last 3 or 4 years. And you can see, you know, it was like, historically it's been around 400 per 1,000 board feet, 350, somewhere in there. It was up, you know, almost 1,700 at the peak, and then went down and then came back up. It's hovering right around 500 now. But, you know, lumber's pretty significant on, I was looking at some of the data when I was putting together these slides, and we had this one house, 3,300 square foot house, that normally the lumber pack would be $40,000. We built 2 of them at $98,000. That's, you know, on that size house, $14 a square foot just for lumber increase. How do you plan for that? How do you build that into your pro forma when you figure out, you know, as Roseanne said, the land is a big chunk of it, but then you have to build your houses to figure out what your eventual profit is. How do you deal with something like that? It's, I don't know, it's hard. This was out of, I think, one of the recent HBA emails. They were talking about prices for all building materials are up, you know, 35% since January of 2020, and 80% of that increase is just since January of 21. And you notice it's not going down. And it's not going down anytime soon. So everything's more expensive. Sorry. I hear that, but you don't, hopefully. So here's some examples from the guy in our home building group, Scott. So on insulation, we couldn't get bat insulation, you know, like the fiberglass bats. So we had to go with blown in, and that basically almost doubled the cost on the insulation. Cabinets were 4 to 6 week delayed. And remember, when you're building a house, you have a schedule, and you need to meet certain milestones so that your other trades can come in and do their work. And if you miss here, you put everybody else off, and then you run the risk that they're just going to leave and go work somewhere else and not come back. And then, you know, you're scrambling. So he's always scrambling. But anyway, cabinets, he was running into 4 to 6 week delays and a 25% increase. Garage doors we had finished houses with plywood covering the garage openings because we couldn't get garage doors for weeks, months even. 20-week delays and 10 to 15% cost increases. Appliances were the funny thing. We closed a bunch of houses with loaner appliances because they paid for the, you know, nice premium appliance package that we couldn't get for 4 months or whatever. And they cost 20% more. So for us, he was saying it was like $12 to $15 a square foot, not counting lumber or energy code increases and things like that we've seen in the last couple of years. And again, as you saw in that graph before, it's not getting better. So there's a real squeeze on the margins for home building. Some of the other issues, labor shortages again, notice that's a pretty common theme, labor shortages and keeping people on the job. Permitting costs are going up. The time for permits is taking longer. SDCs, as I mentioned, particularly with middle housing, and as you get into some of the smaller housing types, there needs to be sliding scales on the SDCs to make it make sense and end up with the goal, which is affordable housing. Because if you don't have sliding scales, then it's going to be hard to be affordable because everything costs more. You know, energy code changes are important, and it's good to have energy efficiency and all of that, but it's an added cost. I mean, we're looking at, you know, takes longer to design and permit things, and some of these new energy code requirements for the open web, ceiling trusses and having to have everything in, you know, heated or maintained space, adds about $10,000 to $15,000 a house. And then, you know, when you're looking at, there's a little bit of a tension too from the home builder side of things when you're looking at getting into more affordable houses and smaller houses and attached houses. Because it adds cost. You have to redesign your product line. You have to deal with fire codes that you didn't have to deal with before, things like that. And then, of course, you know, COVID, and I'm wearing the mask, but COVID's kind of mellowed for the most part. But, you know, it was really bad when all the regulations were out there. And, you know, you had to have people stay 6 feet apart. I mean, how do you build a house with people staying 6 feet apart? It was hard. And you'd also lose entire crews because they didn't stay 6 feet apart and they all got COVID. So it's not as bad, but you know, it could become an issue and something to watch out for. Again, some uncertainty. So finally, just some headwinds. You know, mortgage rates were historically low forever, not anymore. They've doubled almost in the last year. It's still sitting right around 5.1 this morning, I saw from Fannie Mac, but you know, that's put a real pressure on sales, and house prices are going to adjust accordingly because people can't afford what they could at 3% now that it's almost 6%. And then, you know, Kent mentioned about the affordability, and this was something out of NAHB, 42% at the end of, from April to June was affordable for a family making $90,000 a year, down from 57% the quarter before. So 1/4 dropped that much. And that's a real, you know, housing affordability is a real issue that we all need to work toward finding a solution to, and going to smaller, more attached, more dense is one way to look at it. That, of course, goes against the whole trend of people trying to get out of that situation. So anyway, that's what I've got. Thank you very much, and I guess we have one more speaker, and then we'll answer questions.
Just big arrow. Okay. Good morning. I'm Devin Ellen. I'm the Housing Development Director with the Housing Authority of Clackamas County. And I'm here today to primarily talk about the county's progress on the Metro Affordable Housing Bond Program. But I also will provide some updates on other projects that we have in our pipeline. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So first, I want to make sure everyone is aware of what the Housing Authority does. Our core mission is to provide low rent or free apartments for low-income residents. At HAC, we oversee 445 units of public housing and nearly 775 units of affordable housing. And I differentiate public housing from affordable housing because public housing, as it applies to the Housing Authority, is specifically housing for low-income households that is wholly funded by the federal government through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, commonly known as HUD. I use the term affordable housing to describe housing affordable to low-income households that is funded through other programs, more like public-private partnerships. These can be projects funded with local funds like the Metro bonds, state funding, or the federal low-income housing tax credit program, or some combination of some or all of these. These sources all require some form of long-term rent assistance to be placed on the property. We also oversee rental assistance programs at the Housing Authority, and these are programs like the Section 8 voucher program or the Regional Long-Term Rental Assistance Program. We have a team of resident service providers that connects residents with services and activities that strive to improve their quality of life. Our asset management team oversees and maintains our properties and ensures our assets are in compliance with regulators and our financial partners. And my team, the housing development team, works on increasing the number of affordable units countywide through direct development and partnerships. And we also oversee the administration of the Metro Affordable Housing Bond Program, which I'll talk about more. And finally, the Housing Authority is responsible for the administration of the Supportive Housing Services Program, which is the Metro measure that was passed in 2020 that funds supportive services, shelter and transitional housing, and rental assistance for homeless and very low-income households. So, as many of you are aware, in 2018, voters approved a nearly $653 million regional affordable housing bond. Clackamas County received approximately 21% of that, and the bond revenues total about $118 million. So Clackamas County's production goals for the Metro Bond Funds are to create housing for over 2,500 county residents by developing or acquiring at least 812 new affordable housing units. Of those housing units, half of them must be 2 bedrooms or larger, and 40%, or at least 333 units, must include rents that are restricted so they are affordable to extremely low-income households earning 30% of the area median income. And that translates to about $22,000 per year for a one-person household, or $32,000 per year for a 4-person household. And then up to 10% of the funding can be used to create affordable homes for households earning between 61 and 80% of the area median income, and that's about up to $85,000 per year for a 4-person household. In addition to creating production goals, the county also established guiding principles that aim to sustain Clackamas County's livability, particularly for those most in need. These include a commitment to displacement prevention, advancing racial equity and inclusion, creating affordable housing options in locations where there are none, and helping address homelessness in the community. They also include creating housing access and opportunities for vulnerable and marginalized communities. So far, Clackamas County has identified 7 projects to receive an allocation of bond funding. One of these has completed construction, 1 will wrap up next month, 2 are in construction, 1 will be starting next month, and 2 others are working through pre-development and land use. As you can see, the locations are dispersed through the metro-eligible region of Clackamas County, with projects in Milwaukee, Happy Valley, Gladstone, Lake Oswego, and here in Oregon City. These 7 projects will produce 886 units, exceeding the county's bond goal of 812 units by 109%, while utilizing only 78% of its allocation. So we still have about $26.5 million to allocate, and we project funding between 250 and 300 additional units with our remaining allocation. So this slide outlines all of the affordable units in the Housing Authority's pipeline since 2020 and where they are in the development process. And the projects shaded in blue are funded with Metro bonds. So I'm going to roll through these next slides pretty quickly, but I wanted to provide some pictures and renderings of bond projects underway or completed so you can all get a sense of what affordable housing can look like. This is Tukwila Springs in Gladstone. It includes 48 units serving extremely low or no income households, paired with robust supportive services that focus on stabilizing individuals exiting homelessness. This project opened in July and is now fully leased. This is Fuller Station Apartments, located adjacent to the Fuller Max Station. It includes 100 units of transit-oriented units serving families and individuals with low incomes, and 25 units will serve extremely low income households that are exiting homelessness. And this project will open next month. This is the Good Shepherd Village project located in Happy Valley. It includes 143 units, including 35 units serving homeless households, and 15 of those will be prioritized for homeless veterans. And this project will open in the fall of next year. This is Maple Apartments, located here in Oregon City. It's under construction, and it will consist of 171 units serving families and individuals with low incomes. 43 units will be prioritized for agricultural workers and field laborers, and 9 units will serve households exiting homelessness. A total of 70 units will serve extremely low-income households, so that 30% AMI and below. And this project will open in the winter of next year. And here is renderings of the Merrillhurst Commons project, located in Lake Oswego on the former Merrillhurst University campus. It will consist of 100 units serving families and individuals with low incomes. 40 units will serve families with extremely low incomes exiting homelessness. And this project will start construction next month. And finally, we have our Lake Grove project. It's located in the Lake Grove neighborhood of Lake Oswego on a site that was formerly used by the city for construction staging. So the Housing Authority, Metro, and the city of Lake Oswego are collaborating to facilitate the development of 50 units, and we're currently engaging the community and stakeholder groups to create a vision for the development. And we plan to release a developer solicitation for the site in the first half of next year. Okay, so in these next few slides, I'm going to touch upon public housing and the Housing Authority's plan to transition these projects from public housing to Section 8. So a very public project to a public-private partnership. So the Housing Authority, you may not know, is the oldest housing authority in Oregon, and we have some of the oldest public housing stock in Oregon. And the world of public housing is in transition. Public housing authorities across the country are struggling with aging housing stock that requires significant capital needs paired with continued financial divestment from HUD. And remember what I said at the beginning of this presentation, public housing is 100% funded by annual allocations from the federal government. So we can't refinance these properties to support rehabilitation. In fact, we can't incur any debt on the property. So it's very limited. So at the Housing Authority, we're really evaluating our assets and considering how we can strategically invest and meet our mission to our residents and then maintain our financial sustainability. And after nearly 80 years of operation, we're facing some major challenges, namely maintaining our housing stock with an insufficient budget while attempting to respond to an increased demand for affordable housing. And we're not alone in this conundrum. So this is happening countrywide. And in recent years, HUD has made a variety of strategies available to housing authorities to transition or reposition their public housing developments. So repositioning means taking families from the public housing platform, 100% funded by the government, to Section 8, which you can kind of weave together with other financing sources to create public-private partnerships. So these strategies, this transition, can help housing authorities provide better maintained units, leverage public and private resources, increase local control, and preserve our affordable housing. Section 8 programs can be combined with other sources, like I said, like the low-income housing tax credit, which is basically the the most widely used tool available to affordable housing developers in the country, and then state resources and local resources like the Metro Bond. Public housing, you cannot do that. Under public housing, the Housing Authority is, yes, like I said, just completely reliant on appropriation from HUD. And as you can see from the chart, the appropriations are not trending in the same direction as the need for affordable housing. So the passing of the Metro Housing Bond provides the Housing Authority with a unique opportunity to utilize its existing public housing to leverage public and private resources to sustainably increase our housing opportunities in Clackamas County. And as outlined in our Metro Bond implementation strategy, we set aside half of our bond revenues to reposition our public housing. And so this is the Hillside Manor project. It's a 9-story tower located in Milwaukee. This project was converted from public housing to Section 8 affordable housing. And it just, really allowed us to renovate the property and bring it into, current seismic standards and all the things that were needed. And so we're now in the process of repositioning Hillside Park. So Hillside Manor, you can kind of see that's the tower that was renovated recently, and then Hillside Park is all the public housing surrounding that. It's a 16-acre site, consists of 100 units that were built in the 1940s, lots of deferred maintenance. It's the oldest public housing in Oregon. So we went through a master planning process that envisioned the redevelopment. We had a big public engagement process and developed this master plan concept that proposes to demolish the existing public housing and redevelop with up to 500 units of additional housing, and that's mixed income. So there'll be affordable housing, there'll be market rate. All the existing residents will be relocated with rental assistance vouchers, and once the units are built, they'll be given the first choice to move back to the property. So the master plan was approved and adopted by City Council last November. So the entitlements are now in place, as Roseanne described. And earlier this year, the Housing Authority released a competitive solicitation seeking a developer to redevelop the site as the master plan envisions. And we selected Related Northwest, and we're hoping to break ground in early 2024. On the first phase of development, which includes the kind of bottom portion of the site, and that's 275 new affordable units. So these repositioning projects are especially relevant to Oregon City because the Housing Authority's 2 other large-scale public housing projects are located here. So this is the Clackamas Heights Public Housing. It's located on a 16-acre site in the Park Place neighborhood, also built in the 1940s. The units have no foundations and have long surpassed their useful life. But again, we're under public housing, so there's not much we can do about it. So we feel like we really owe it to our residents and the community to upgrade these units to create safe and sustainable homes. And this is our other one, just up the road on Holcomb. This is Oregon City View Manor. It's situated on 22 acres. Also consists of 100 units of public housing built in 1962. So these 2 projects are kind of next in the Housing Authority's pipeline to redevelop, and we want to engage the community and residents and stakeholders about future uses for the sites. So here's my contact information. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, Devin, thank you very much. Well, I'm glad to hear that Oregon City is next in line for 2 projects, and I'm very familiar with those 2 sites. So long overdue, but it's tremendous opportunity to go ahead and provide a much better utilized asset than what the existing situation is right now. So as I said at the very beginning, there are a lot of information to absorb today, coming at it from a lot of different directions. So now we're going to go ahead and do the Q&A portion, but before we do that, I did want to acknowledge our elected officials that we have here today. I purposely waited till later because sometimes the county commissioners will come in halfway through the meeting and I never get a chance to mention their name. So we have State Senator Bill Kennemer, State Representative Mark Meek, and County Commissioner Paul Savas. Thank you for coming today. And obviously, those people in the elected positions have a lot of input as to how the housing policy for our state, for our county, and for our region is formulated. And we really appreciate all the effort and time that all three of you have put in to, try to invigorate the industries and try to overcome a lot of the challenges that you heard about today. Some of them we can fix, but some of them are going to take a lot of leadership, and we certainly appreciate all of that. And I want to thank all our speakers today, Aquila, Roseanne, Harlan, and Devin. Great presentation, so thank you very much. So go ahead and start sending in your questions so we can go ahead and ask them. If I could have all four of you come up, we'll let you use the mic here to go ahead and answer them so we can get it on the Zoom conference. You have to be up here so that we can see you. So I'm going to kick it off because being in the development business for close to 40 years now, this topic was very near and dear to my heart because I track a lot of these statistics. So for 6 months straight now, house sales have dropped across the United States. A lot of people may not know that, but home sales are going down. As I mentioned earlier, the affordability index for new buyers is at its lowest point since 1989. A lot of people say housing is already in a recession, and we don't know how bad it's going to be. The Federal Reserve has another federal funds rate increase next month. Was going to be 75 basis points. It may be only 50 because inflation may have peaked, but we really don't know. But if housing continues to drop and they continue to have cancellations of purchase contracts, which is the highest it's been in a decade, do you think the housing recession could take the rest of the country into recession? A biggie. A biggie.
So that's interesting. I would say it's, even though on my slide I said it felt like 2005, which housing obviously led the downturn, but that was more about Wall Street than really housing. I don't think so. I think there's actually more pressure for a recession than from housing. So I don't think housing's going to drop that much. So I don't think it'll be the cause.
That's a very optimistic viewpoint.
I tend to be optimistic.
To be in this industry, you have to be optimistic.
I have to be optimistic. Anybody else want to talk about that? No? Okay.
Do you want more people to answer that?
Well, I just kind of threw it out if anybody wanted to comment. It's kind of a 30,000-foot level.
I would agree that because the reason that we might be in a recession is different than the Great Recession of 06, 07, because we have so much demand for all types of housing. So I think there needs to be an adjustment in kind of either expectations for the type of housing that you buy, or how far your money will go with your mortgage now. I think this is like an adjustment period. But we have so much nationwide, statewide, and local demand for housing. Hopefully, households that form can adjust their expectations and meet their needs, their basic fundamental housing needs, by those household adjustments to what their mortgage can afford them.
Yeah, along those lines, the Case-Shiller Index that measures I think it's the top 30 metro markets for price appreciation month to month, they said half of the markets in that index have already had home prices decrease. because a lot of buyers are wary about making an investment right now if they think the economy is going to go in a recession and what they paid X for is now only going to be worth Y. They don't want to make that investment. They saw what happened in the Great Recession when home prices really, really dropped. And that was a scary time. But that came about for other reasons. So let's go on to some other questions from our audience. Are there any requirements, and this goes to Devin, are there any requirements for those getting housing that are exiting homelessness, such as getting clean from drugs or getting jobs? Do they get help with budgeting or finances?
Well, it kind of depends property to property, depending on who's managing it. I think one of the first things that, the Housing Authority aims to do is just get people housed. There's no, necessarily a requirement for sobriety, but we do try to partner folks in our housing with social services, and that's a big, the supportive housing services measure that passed is greatly increasing the amount of funding that we can use to support social services at our buildings. Before it was like, okay, we can build the housing, but we get folks coming in off the streets with lots of trauma, and we had really no mechanism or funding source to serve them. So now, in partnership with the bond and the supportive housing services measure, we're able to provide that more.
Okay, great, thank you. This one I think maybe is best for you, Aquila. We see empty lots as we drive around the city, but yet we hear there's no developable land available. And the question was, what is being done to go ahead and provide infill housing on vacant land? But I think there's also, it goes beyond that, being in development. Just because you see a vacant lot does not mean it's zoned correctly. It may have a sensitive overlay on it, such as a wetland, a riparian corridor, steep slopes, hillside protections. So did the city ever do an inventory as to how many available lots there are in the city that could actually be developed that are clean of all these challenges?
Yes and no. So part of the housing needs analysis is a buildable land inventory. So we looked at what's inside the city, meaning inside the boundaries already, and then what's in our concept plan areas, so land that would still need to be annexed. I don't know that we broke it down to what type of lots don't have any overlays and are easy to develop. Honestly, I'm not sure that we in the planning department are the best judges of what's easy to develop. That's probably more in ICON and developers' realm to make that decision. And like you said about seeing vacant lots around, sometimes people just hold on to their lots. They may not be ready to sell them for whatever reason, and it depends on what they're zoned and if they're attractive to a developer who wants to put something up there. So, yeah, lots of reasons for that.
There are, and I think, Harlan, you hit on this when you basically said in 2000, your comment was, yikes, this feels like 2005. But going back to when the urban growth boundary was originally established decades ago, there was a lot of land in the urban growth boundary. Obviously, a lot of those lands have now been developed. And so we're really looking at lands that everybody has passed on, are the ones that are still left. Well, why did they pass on it? For a lot of the reasons why these vacant lots are still here. There's something too challenging on that piece of property that facilitates a further development of it. And so I know Metro, sometimes the Home Builder Association would have an issue when they go, well, the cities have to maintain a 20-year supply of buildable land. But the homeowners would say, but is it really buildable? You have the land in your city limits, but is it really buildable? If it's buildable, why has it not been built on? So I think Metro is going to be going through a reevaluation of how they classify inventory. Okay, keep those questions coming now. Why is HUD repositioning from public housing to Section 8?
Well, I think it's frankly that they realize that they're not able to maintain properties without some, other source of funds to be able to maintain them. And the way that public housing is currently set up, again, you just can't commingle funds. And so I think a lot of developers and housing authorities are moving to the Section 8 platform, which allows us to use a variety of different sources. It allows us to refinance and rehabilitate the property on more of a, a normal schedule every 20 to 30 years. Whereas public housing is just like whatever the government decides to allocate towards HUD that year, and the public housing program is kind of what you get, and you have to, do your best to maintain the property, but it doesn't provide funds necessarily to fully renovate or rehab the properties.
Okay, great. This question would probably be for Harlan and Roseanne. What is your feeling about the supply chain issues? Have we seen the worst? Is it going to get better? And do you foresee ever homes being prefab constructed in factories and then just shipped out to the site where all the materials could be made available as inventory? Harlan, she wants you to go first again.
All right, so on the supply chain question, I think probably the worst is over, barring, war somewhere else. But it's not getting a whole lot better anytime soon, but I don't think it's going to get worse. On the prefab, there are some movements toward that. Components, there's a Japanese builder here, Ichijo, that's over in Reed's Crossing over in South Hillsborough and a couple other places that do that. They basically build their house in a factory and then ship it in a container and put it together. There's advantages and disadvantages to that, but overall I think, again, being optimistic, the supply chain issues will probably start to dwindle, and the hope is, barring any kind of a real hard recession, that things will be sort of back to normal by second quarter next year maybe.
One final comment I'll make, and it's about land. So the supply chain with respect to land is the thing that I'm most concerned about, and I think that a lot of developers who buy land and then take it through the entitlements process all the way through to the point it can be built on is our biggest concern, is having that land, we call it a pipeline, but a steady supply that will be able to accommodate the needed housing and the household formation for years and decades to come. So I know you were talking about supply chain of materials, it sounded like, but I'm talking about supply chain of actual land to put those materials on.
Well, and to follow up on that comment, Roseanne, because I think it's a very appropriate one, the project that ICON got tentative approval from the OC Planning Commission on last night, I actually started working on 20 years ago.
I know.
That very same project. So here we are. We finally might get one lot out of a piece of land that we started working on 20 years ago. But hopefully that's the exception and not the rule. But the process, I guess my main takeaway for all of you here is you drive down the street and you see a home being built and you go, oh, a new neighborhood. You have no idea what took place in order to get that neighborhood ready to go. From the regulations, but just finding a piece of land that's zoned for development, having utilities, but there's also something out there called the human factor, and it goes by initials, NIMBYS, NIMBYs. And if you've never heard of that before, it stands for not in my backyard. And they tend to forget that somebody built their home somebody actually had to do the effort that this next person's trying to do so that they could live there. I don't want to get political here, but complain about another home being built for a younger family. And so that's why I think the supply chain needs to be addressed. And that's why I feel the legislature intervened with House Bill 2001 and Senate Bill 458, because the growth wasn't occurring the way Metro wanted it to do. 20 years to get a project approved? Is that good planning? So they go, well, if we're not going to expand, we're just going to rack them, pack them, and stack them. And that's what House Bill 2001 and Senate Bill 458 could do. But it'll be interesting. You know, I'm already doing my own House Bill 2001, Senate Bill 458 project. So we'll see how it plays out. Okay, another question here. And how are we doing on time? 2 minutes? Okay. Are you looking into automation and building to deal with challenges in the labor supply as well?
I'm not on the construction side.
No.
Okay. All right. Well, since we only had 2 minutes, I guess we'll wrap it up with that then.
Stretch? No.
Okay. Well, thank you to our presenters today. Thank you. All right. Good job. All right. Well, that was a lot of fun. Stay tuned. Well, hopefully we'll get another project done in 20 years. So next month, we're going to go a different direction. We have Clackamas Community College President Tim Cook coming. He's going to be discussing the future of learning. You know, the pandemic taught the schools a lot of lessons on how do we conduct our ability to train people when they can't be here on site. And innovation with artificial intelligence, how do we prepare our students for the jobs of tomorrow when we don't even know what those jobs are yet? The industries that are in existence tomorrow may not even be here today. But somehow we've got to start training our students and workers that are changing careers to be ready and prepared for what those new employment opportunities are. And so Community College President Tim Cook is going to share us his ideas and his vision on that. So we hope you can all be here. Again, it's the 4th Tuesday of every month here at the Abernathy Center. We thank you all for coming. Summer is still here with us for at least another week. Going to be in the 90s tomorrow. So enjoy the Northwest and see you next week. Or not next week, next month.